Hi, and welcome to Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry Dasilva, and today we've got a great show and kind of take a little trip, perhaps a magical mystery trip, if you want to call it that. We have a terrific book by a great author, sociologist, Dr. Candy Leonard, who has written a book that captures the experience of growing up with the Beatles as told by first generation fans, and I guess I'm one of those too, so it'll be kind of a little bit of a trip and learn some new things and maybe even stump her with something, I don't know. But The Beatleness is the name of the book, How the Beatles and Their Fans Remade the World, and the book is put out by Arcade, Skyhorse Publishing, and Dr. Candy Leonard, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me, Larry. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tell me now, obviously, you lived through that time as a young girl growing up in Queens. So we know that these thoughts and these ideas were in your head from a young age. But over the last few years, what finally was the motivation to put all this down on paper and tell us and educate us all about this?
Well, as you correctly point out, I was kind of caught up in the phenomenon ever since I was 7 years old. And then as I progressed through school and went on through life, I would talk about the Beatles with people, talk about that experience. And sort of two things happened. I would run into people who would say, "Oh yeah, when the Beatles were on Sullivan, wasn't that great? Didn't it change everything?" Or growing up with the Beatles, and just to share that experience of listening to that music, watching them evolve, discussing them with your friends, and absorbing all these amazing ideas and images, and of course the sounds that they expose us to. So I would meet people over the years who kind of confirmed for me that this was indeed something amazing and that it was a story that needed to be told. And the other thing that happened is that as I went through school studying psychology and sociology and child development, so many times I would read something or learn a framework or a set of theories and think, oh, wow, that could be used to explain Beatlemania or the Beatles or whatever. So it was kind of always in the back of my mind. And then, of course, 2014 was the 50th anniversary of Beatles coming to the U.S. And so I thought, all right, well, it's kind of now, or I guess it was the end of 2012, I realized that if I was going to write this thing, which I had actually started several times, probably the first time in 1999, then I started in 2004, and, life gets in the way, and so you're kind of labor of love type projects you have to put aside. But I decided it was time to do this. I had to do it. And, every time I would check back and see if anybody had done this yet, of course, nobody had done it, which kind of also got me thinking, all right, well, it's because I have to do it. So I did it.
Right, and you're looking at it again from not only an author's point of view, but a sociological, study type of view.
There were a couple of gaps. I mean, there's thousands of books about the Beatles. I mean, a reasonable question is why write another book about the Beatles? And of course, people did ask me that, and people do ask me that. But where this is different is that I wanted to take on the question. People always say the Beatles changed everything. The Beatles changed everything. And we kind of, it sounds like hyperbole, or we accept it, whatever. I wanted to examine that, and I had the sense that by interviewing fans and doing these in-depth interviews with fans, that I would see how, or would I see how the Beatles impacted fans personally, and then looking at that collectively as a generation, that that it sort of becomes visible. Sort of like pulling back the curtain on how it is that they had this impact. But the other thing is that all these thousands of books about the Beatles that are out there, they're all written by men, with 99.9%,
Right.
which was kind of funny to me because we associate the Beatle fandom with screaming girls. So yet when 50 years on, when it comes time to tell the story, girls are not telling this story. And of course, the other thing is that there were no books about the fans. So, as I said a few minutes ago, I mean, I had to do this.
And you bring up a good point. I honestly never thought of that apart from perhaps like George Harrison's ex-wife and
Exactly.
very few those kind of things. But yours is not about he did this. I mean, we'll talk about things that occurred and memories
It's
that you and I have, but you're bringing it from the point of view of what the fans and the impact and what they thought about what was going on during that decade.
right, and it's from the fans' perspective, and it's also it's a sociological analysis, really, of the whole Beatle phenomenon, which nobody had kind of taken on before, I guess you could say. So it goes into, why the particular moment in February of '64 was ripe for them and for us to be receptive to them. And how, the thing that we were just talking about, the screaming girls, but a lot of it, in fact, these first generation fans were children. And so baby boomers as young as, like myself, I was 7 years old, all the way up through even college age, were tuned in and focused on them for 6 years. And so and these were years of, important development in the life of a child and adolescent. So they really had a very profound impact.
Now, two things I know growing up, and you hear about this in the books that you spoke of earlier, is, of course, the post-Kennedy era, Kennedy assassination having happened, a couple of months earlier before the Sullivan appearances. And the other thing, too, that, people our age talk about, too, is, I don't know if I'd use the word atrocious, but there was some good stuff. But I mean, the state of music in the early 60s, those two factors are the predominant ones that most lay people, kind of focus in on, that really let the door open for them to bring in this, what became the British invasion, because some of the music was, was beyond description.
Yeah, it was pretty insipid, pretty, vacuous, whatever you want to call it. What happened was, part of, the real innovators of rock and roll were no longer on the scene. And, also, white America didn't really particularly like their kids listening to rhythm and blues and, the Little Richards and the Chuck Berrys of the world. So, and of course, for various reasons, these other artists either were in prison or stopped recording. Little Richard joined the Ministry. So, and of course, the famous plane crash where the Big Bopper and Buddy Holly and
Richie Valens, yeah.
And Richie Valens died. So there, and of course Elvis had gone into the army, and well, as John Lennon famously said, Elvis died when he went into the army. Now, when he came out, his career never took off. He never had the stature that he had before. So there really kind of was this gap. And what you had, if you look at the charts before the Beatles came on, there were these like cookie cutter white male crooners, the Bobby Rydells, the Bobby V's, the Bobby Vintons, just like so many of them. And some of whom, names have been forgotten. Some of them are, well known and kind of continued to be sort of important historically, but for the most part, yes, there was not a whole lot happening in music. Now, of course, this is in white music. There was still a lot of, on the R&B charts. Motown was already putting out some great music. Stax was putting out. So there was other music, but for the kids who got caught up in Beatlemania, i.e., white middle class kids, there wasn't a whole lot going on.
And the control of it, of course, even though a kid could, go into a record store. And maybe in some places they could listen to, a selection and say, sure, I'll take, that, Jerry Butler. And again, I'm using someone more tame, but, or the Chiffons or the early Supremes, then, white middle-class radio controlled the airwaves. So really that was keeping the sound at bay, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Chiffons. I mean, the girl groups were, maybe probably one of the most interesting things going on at that time, that sound, which did get played on Top 40 radio. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, they really came at a time when music, there was no innovation, there was nothing new. Elvis was the last thing that had happened, and that was 8 years prior to the Beatles, so...
Now, tell me, you mentioned earlier about, female voices and opinions, again, not being represented well. Again, another thing that I didn't think of until I read your book. But again, obviously when you see old clips, newsreel footage, I mean, it's always the girls. You never see, or even on the Sullivan Show, you never saw, you might see a kid, yeah, who's caught up in the moment, a boy, but otherwise it's always the girls having these nervous breakdowns. So it's interesting that we saw that, but yet it's almost like they weren't able to verbally, at length vocalize what their feelings were about the whole era.
Right. I mean, the press at the time and all the pundits were, why are the girls screaming like this? And, because we had seen similar kinds of things with Elvis and Sinatra before that, but this was at a whole other level. It was at a much grander scale for lots of reasons. And so the press was like, what, why are these girls screaming? What's going on? And, they didn't see. I mean, the takeaway message really from all the screaming was that women, young girls, and again, it was an age range. It was, all through from basically preschool through college age, that they found these men appealing, right? These men who had long hair, who were not macho. They presented a different kind of masculinity. That was, and of course the music was compelling. The lyrics, even early on, were compelling, and so but the takeaway was that women in 1964 liked men who look, sound, and act like the Beatles. That with their audacious style, their rebelliousness, their cheekiness, they were so compelling. Plus the fact that girls couldn't. There weren't many places in 1964 where girls could get together and scream in public. That was just not allowed. I mean, when I talk about the book in college on college campuses, people are always surprised that the hair got so much attention early on. And same thing with the screaming, because what it gets to is the gender roles at the time. There was so much conformity and so much. Conformity, constraint. It was just very uptight culture, I mean, I guess a good example, I think captures it very well, is the TV show Mad Men, where you see the style of dress and the formality, but there was just things were more formal. The conforming, I think it probably also is related to the Cold War, because everything was about communists and fear of communists and subversives. And so people just kind of wanted to look like everybody else, be like everybody else, be like the Joneses, buy the right things. And of course, Madison Avenue making you feel like you had to buy the right things. So there was this kind of conformity. And here these guys come along and kind of blow all this out of the water. But back to the girls and the screaming, there were these very rigid gender roles then. So for these girls to go out with their friends and actually be in an arena, even if with 10,000 other people with these guys, was just the biggest thrill of a lifetime. And 50 years later, they still talk about it as really anybody who saw them live talks about it still as one of the high points of their life.
You had a photo in the book, and again, it's kind of grainy, but I mean, obviously a person who owned it, or obviously you must have known them or had access to it, was a photo that it was a shot taken at a Comiskey Park concert. And I'm like, okay, and I get it. And I saw it finally, and I thought, to them, this must be worth the weight in gold,
Exactly.
But it's...
Yeah, well, all the pictures in there were actually artifacts, souvenirs, mementos that fans had that they scanned and sent to me. But it's funny, the one that you're mentioning of it's a shot of the Beatles at Comiskey Park taken through a brownie camera. It's barely, but when I sent it to my publisher, I said, this is one of the pictures I want to be included in the book. They said, this is all out of focus. No, but the whole beauty of that picture is the love and the reverence. That it was so important to capture that experience.
That's all we had. I mean, in terms of, instantaneous shots, not like today where, oh, pardon me for tripping over you while you're taking a selfie, or we have selfie sticks. I mean, it's just...
And related to that, we also never knew when we would see them again. This is why every TV appearance was such a big deal, or when they came out, when A Hard Day's Night came out, people just couldn't get enough of it. They fans talk about sitting in the movie, which you could do in those days. They didn't throw you out. You could sit there all day, and they did, because you never knew when you'd get to see them again.
That's right. Candy Leonard joining us here on this episode of Studio 411, Beatleness, how the Beatles and their fans remade the world. I'm making notes feverishly and saying, I got to remember to tell her this, tell her that. Saw an interview with Little Richard years ago where Little Richard said, you talked about the thing where parents were very restrictive, or so they thought, and he joked how a lot of artists, covered his records. Fats Domino, Pat Boone was notorious for his label doing that, and I think it was Tutti Frutti.
Yes.
And his joke, and it was true. I mean, you know that kids are going to get by no matter what it took. He said, yeah, they would get both singles. They would put mine in the sock drawer, and they would put Pat's on top of the dresser. So, and that's very, very much the case. Kids were not going to be denied. Look how long it took in the Soviet Union. There was a great documentary years ago I saw about the infiltration of the Beatles, their sound, the whole thing. It was a great documentary. I wish I could remember the name of it. And it was just like, they were bootlegs. Yeah, they were bootlegs selling for like, who knows, rubles beyond belief. I mean, they were going to get their sound no matter what it took. And the Beatles didn't show up and say, here's my records. It just, stuff filtered in. It was not to be denied.
They went viral before going viral was even a thing.
Exactly.
I mean, like Paul is Dead is really a great example of that. Yeah. How this thing just spread like crazy. Even just because if you think about how the Beatles were experienced in with family, with siblings, with kids down the street, in neighborhoods, so you had these neighborhoods, cul-de-sacs. There's, people talk about this in the book, where there were, 5 houses on our cul-de-sac, each one with like 3 or 4 school-age kids, all Beatle fans. So you just picture this buzz, like all over the country, going on and on and on, with these young people of all ages sitting around talking about the Beatles, and this is what Beatlemania was.
You talk about the hair length. I mean, there are people now that I've heard and read that said the hair length really, compared to today, is really not that big a deal. But it was just so, again, I don't know, maybe because they weren't using the oily grease that, Ed Burns and Elvis and so many others used. Here's a photo, and this is actually a shorter length than what you saw later on. I don't know if the camera can pick this up or not, but again, this is what people were going crazy about. Not the music, that I could understand, but the whole thing with the look, the hair. My hair is about the same length. I mean, it just.
It was the hair. The hair was combed down, like all those artists we were talking about before. All those cookie cutter male crooners, they all had hair kind of combed back, pompadour or sort of short. The Beatles combed their hair forward. It was styled. So there was the hair, but there were also the suits, the way they stood, the way they moved. If you look at the footage of the Ed Sullivan Show, it's really, which I do from time to time. It really is astounding at how different they were. I mean, I think we lose sight of that over time. Obviously, things change, but it was really, we had never seen human beings that looked like this.
You talk about Ed Sullivan, again, 73 million viewers, saw the first of 3 consecutive appearances in February of 1964. 90% of all households. I heard that when Elvis was on Sullivan, it was about 65-70% of households. Again, impressive nonetheless, but 90% of all televisions, or all households that had a television, were watching, the 3 consecutive weeks. I guess the first one was in New York, correct? Second one was in Miami, and then
and the third one was in New York, was actually taped the same time as the first one.
Gotcha. Okay.
They were 3 consecutive weeks, and it just built and built and built. I mean, if you missed it the first week, you were suddenly shut out of the conversation at school that
Right.
Monday morning. I mean, it was all anybody talked about on the school bus and the cafeterias, all anybody talked about. So if you missed it, then you got to see it the second week, and then, of course, the third week. So there was this kind of explosion of Beatles in our lives in that February. And, of course, then by April, the first week of April, the top 5 songs in the country were all by them. That had never happened before or since. So there was this total saturation of getting just captivated by them and staying captivated. They grabbed our attention, and we basically didn't look away for 6 years.
You tell a story in your book about, again, we talked, raised in Queens, you were a young schoolgirl, you did a current events paper, and then it was returned or handed back to you as not newsworthy. Now, I wanted to know, what rock was that teacher hiding under?
Well, that's I remember this like it was yesterday. Mrs. Lab at PS 200. Because we were all already at that point. All we talked about was the Beatles. I mean, this was the thing. Had. I don't remember if I had a Beatles notebook or not. I probably did, or if I didn't, I wanted one. But you found these ways to kind of bring them to school with you, integrate them into your day. And so the teachers were kind of already sort of, their radar was up for this. And I bring in this article, and she says not newsworthy, which even at the time, it's like, well, of course they're news. First of all, it's in the newspaper, so But how could you say this is not newsworthy? It's all anybody was talking about. It's not only kids but grown-ups on the news, comedians. They became a frame of reference in a way that really, I don't know. I mean, I guess since then there's been comparable things, but at the time nothing had gotten wall-to-wall coverage like they got. Even the Kennedy funeral, which happened 3 months before they came, which was of course a major event, and there were some media firsts around that as well. But no one got coverage like maybe Diana's funeral. You think
Right,
of these events that happened, but it was unprecedented really at the time.
Just to jump ahead, could a phenomena like that, not necessarily music, but I guess would have to be in the entertainment world, but could something like that, the way it was orchestrated, the way it was, pulled off, some of it luck, some of it perhaps very savvy marketing, whatever, could something like that take place today with the in-your-face coverage? Every second of the day, there's somebody with a camera in your face with, there's nothing left to the imagination or surprise anymore.
Well, I mean, they were bigger than anybody had ever been, right? So once that happens, it sort of can't happen again. And I think one of the major differences now is that the audience for entertainment is so much more fragmented than it was then. So that night that they appeared on Ed Sullivan, if you didn't want to watch that, you had two other choices as to what watch on TV. Well, now there's thousands of channels, internet. So the entertainment options are really infinite in a way that they were not then, and with that comes very niched tastes. So I mean, they were mass marketed basically, and you can't really mass market an artist like that quite in the same way as you could then. It was unprecedented. I mean, none of it had happened before.
Dr. Candy Leonard joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. Beatleness, how the Beatles and their fans remade the world. A gentleman I just saw on a documentary on the 70s that's running, Anthony DeCurtis, contributing editor of Rolling Stone. I've seen him on many other things, and he has a little comment on the back of Candy's book. Candy Leonard was possessed when she first heard the Beatles, and Beatleness is her story and ours. It's breezy, smart, open-hearted, and everyone who grew up with the band or wants to know what that was like will appreciate its insights and feel its emotional impact, because not like us, not everybody is the same age that we are sitting here conversing right now. There are some, which leads me to another point. The other day, had nothing to do with the research I was doing or the conversations we had prior to taping. Someone sends me a thing on I think it was on my Facebook page, and it was about a dozen kids from the age of about 8 to 15, and it was them going crazy about the Beatles, and they played their performance on Sullivan. They played the Hey Jude video. They played a bunch of other things, and it was just so again, it just keeps cultivating and cultivating. It never stops.
Right. I think people are going to be listening to the Beatles forever, for as long as human beings are listening to music. I think there's a lot of interest in their story, among young people, like teenagers and college students. Many of them find it very interesting, not only because of it's very much a story. Their story is one of perseverance and believing in yourself, but it's also it's really my book is really a cultural history of the 1960s in some sense, told through the eyes of Beatle fans, and a lot of young people are very intrigued with the 60s as a period of time because they know that there was this, all the protest against the war, the hippie movement, the drugs. I mean, a lot of things changed at that time, and I talk about all these things in the book. But it was a period of, it was a renaissance, a revolution, whatever you want to call it, and we witnessed that. And the Beatles were very much a part. If you go into Google and type in the 60s, you're likely a picture of the Beatles is likely to pop up. Sure. Because you can't separate them out of that story of what happened in terms of the Cultural Revolution, sexual revolution, social, whatever you want to call it, that thing that happened in the 60s. They were part of it. And but if the title of the book is How the Beatles and Their Fans Remade the World. So it's not something they did alone. They, they captivated us. They lit up our imaginations and empowered us to take on the establishment, basically.
Now, the word Beatleness, I saw it was listed as a word in the dictionary. So again, when did that become a word? Because initially I thought, Candy created a new word and it took off.
I made that up. You're talking about the thing in the front of the book?
No. The word Beatleness is actually listed as a word. I saw it online. It was actually a bunch of definitions, that was apart from any research on your book. So I thought, when did it become a word? I mean, saying, in terms of just a phrase.
I'm not sure what you're talking about. I mean, in the book, I said it out. It might have been somebody took that thing out of the book because I kind of set it up as though it were a dictionary. I define it as though it were a word in a dictionary.
Oh, okay.
So it's possible that got somehow online somewhere.
If I'm wrong, it needs to be submitted. So you need to do that. Get that. We talked before about the wanting to know every move they made. Here's another album. I'm just holding this so Candy can see this. Again, this is, I don't think it has a lick of music on it. It's just like, the day they fished from the hotel window. Is Paul really married? The boys tell how they got their name. Is John having another baby? Does Paul live with the Ashers? I mean, this was the frenzy of, what was going on, that they wanted to know everything about them.
Everything about them. And, they came from England, which was like, this little town called Liverpool. And we knew it, England and London we'd heard of, but Liverpool became this kind of mythical place, where they came from. And we wanted to know everything about them. Or as David Bowie later said, the papers want to know whose shirts you wear. But that kind of, that intense scrutiny of celebrity and wanting to know everything about them really kind of started with them. There was nothing else in our young lives that was as interesting and as intellectually stimulating, emotionally stimulating, aesthetically stimulating as they were. We even you go to school, you'd want to talk about the Beatles. I mean, it was an obsession. I mean, obviously not everybody, but sure. It was.
Well, when you have 90% of the households, I would say, the majority rules there in terms of, the amount of people. Again, I can relate. My parents, again, they were immigrants, came over in the 50s. Again, they had no issue. You jolted in my mind. I made a note to talk about it. I want to say might have been in 65, 66, one of my mother's birthdays. We actually had a photo of a Beatles cake, and all of a sudden you had the four Beatles. You know how they have like that hard sugary part that was designed. And I know it wasn't for my birthday because I think it was in late summer, and there it was. And it was whatever family was there, and it was like a big deal. Oh, look at the Beatle cake. I mean, you would have thought that you couldn't escape it.
Yeah, people just love them. Everything about, I mean, not everybody. I mean, sort of talking about grown-ups and sort of the our parents' generation, they did not necessarily like them so much. Particularly fathers didn't like them because the hair. Again, I mean, a lot of fathers, it was one thing to be amused when they saw them on Ed Sullivan or in the movies, whatever. But when their sons started wanting to grow their hair long, that's when fathers really, started I don't want enough Beatles. You're not going to watch them. Or fans talked about having their albums confiscated and things. So, there was some parents were cool with it, some not so much. It was more, in fact, there were some kids who were not even allowed to play Beatle records when their father was home. And the mother would sort of conspire with them to to enjoy the Beatles, but not when Grumpy Daddy was around. So.
There you go. You talked about parents, et cetera, et cetera. Just touch really quickly on your parents. I kind of look at them as kind of progressive because a little bit you talk about your upbringing and your parents. They obviously, the person that you became, in my opinion, and how you look at society, whatever, they kind of molded you, I think, in a pretty liberal way. I mean, I got the impression they were pretty hip people for that time.
They were. I think if they'd been a little younger, they probably would have been hippies. They were sort of too old to be hippies, maybe too young to be beatniks. I don't know. They were cool. They were very into pop culture, and they weren't educated. But they were, read a lot. They're very interested in politics and progressive politics, and they were very well read and very intelligent, and they liked the Beatles. I can remember, going to the card store and wanting to buy a magazine or whatever, and they would, give me 15 cents or whatever it was. So they were pretty Beatle friendly as parents go, but not all. I think if both my parents are dead, but I think if they were alive, they would really get a kick out of my book. I think they'd be very proud of me.
I'm sure they would. It reminded me of, again, Beatle bubblegum cards. Again, they were black and white. I remember somewhere I have a couple of those, and it must have been given to me as a gift. Here, buy the kid a pack of cards. I don't know, so much stuff that just, collects, and then we have our little Paul doll, which is not mine, but again, our executive producer, so that has to get back in one piece or else. But anyway, quick Cousin Bruce Morrow story. Of course, you grew up as I did, and now experience them all over again on Sirius radio. Still rocking the music after all these years. He tells this story about when I Want to Hold Your Hand broke. He played it, I think it was 7 or it was 8, but I believe it was 7 consecutive times in a row in 1964 on WABC radio. 7 times in a row.
Yeah, we couldn't get enough of them. I mean, by the time they were on Ed Sullivan, I Want to Hold Your Hand was #1 in the country. And everybody knew that song. And again, it was so uplifting and so cheerful and so, it just had a different sound. There was something about it that was different. Right. And even, like teenagers who might have already been very into music, maybe buying records, recognized that it was different than Ricky Nelson or Elvis or whatever came before. But, those of us who were very young, we went really overnight from listening to, Disney records or Alvin and the Chipmunks or, kids stuff to listening to pop music that teenagers were listening to. And we were not like we weren't casual listeners. We were very tuned in, and we all wanted to have our transistor radios, and which were another factor in why all this was possible, was these ubiquitous, cheap transistor radios, so suddenly you have 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, with this transistor radio that they were inseparable from, listening at night after their parents went to, if parents thought you were asleep, you're listening under the covers. So it was this, they kind of just took over our lives in a very exciting way.
Kids now, or young adults now, they think of, change the 9-volt battery on the smoke alarm. To us in those days, whether it was a ball game or whether it was music, your 9-volt battery was like your lifeline. If that went, you better go in mom's purse. And I don't know how much they cost in those days, but believe me, that was the best. That
Yeah.
was the best to have the transistor.
It was, you felt very powerful. I mean, that was the thing about the Beatles. They made young people feel very empowered for lots of different reasons. And suddenly you're 10 years old and you're walking around with this transistor radio, and you're listening to all this music, and not only the Beatles, but all the great music that came right after them, the British Invasion, the Rolling Stones. And if you look at top 40 throughout the 60s. It's just incredible music, then you get the folk rock period and all of it. And it was a musical renaissance that we listened to and grew up during. And the Beatles really kicked that off. But we were very, very tuned into this at very young ages. And a lot of this music had, not only were we aware of relationships and dating and all that these songs talk about, but of course over the course of the decade they became more explicit, and so we kind of became aware of things that we would not have known about, had we not been living in and listening to this renaissance.
Did you find that their emergence, as well as the other British invasion bands that came along, some solo acts, some female, you talk about that, but not other than Petula Clark, no one with really the staying power that she had. Do you find that made the American groups, especially ones like Beach Boys and others that wrote their own material, kind of was a wake-up call? Like we better get our act together, because otherwise, these guys are progressively, as the years go on, just blowing our socks off with these lyrics and the content in their music.
Right. Well, after the Beatles, it sort of became, prior to the Beatles, actually there's a fabulous story about Carole King and the Brill Building that I just watched recently. But, before the Beatles, there were songwriters who worked in offices who wrote songs for other performers. And the Beatles changed that whole system. So it became like you had to write your own songs and your own music after that. And the Rolling Stones started doing that, and all the other, most of the other, not all, but many, started writing their own music, and so it changed the whole songwriting industry.
I thought you talked earlier in the book that you kind of had 3 age ranges that you talked about. Perhaps maybe one might have been like my range, 5 to 11. Then you had like 12 to 16, and then you had, as you talked about, the older teenagers. And again, each one of them kind of took in this whole Beatlemania thing, maybe in a slightly different way.
Sure. Well, I think with all art, the meaning is kind of co-created between the artist and what the observer or the audience listener brings to that encounter. And so, Norwegian Wood is a good example of this, where where the 7 or 8 year old laughed at the idea of she's sleeping in a bathtub. What does that mean? A little bit older, kind of, there's some kind of boy-girl thing happening there. I don't know quite what it is. And then, of course, you have older fans who hear it as, sexual freedom, open, self-expression. So there's this kind of, wherever you were at, you could get into it. And so even with Sgt. Pepper, as an example, so, there's these sounds and images that even a young person can appreciate. But as you move up in age, the art of it, the meaning, the cultural commentary, which may not be accessible to a 10 or 11-year-old, the college student hears it. So whatever you brought to the Beatles, you got something out of it, regardless of how old you were.
Dr. Candy Leonard joining us here for the hour on Studio 411. Beatleness, the name of the book, How the Beatles and Their Fans Remade the World, and also out now in paperback. So that's good to hear. And I have to ask a question. I think I have the correct answer. What is your favorite Beatle album?
Oh, gee.
I thought I read you had one, but maybe I'm wrong.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I said I thought I read you had one, unless maybe it was a fan talking, but I have it in my hand. Let's see if I can
I
telepathically.
Favorite album? That's really tough. Sometimes I say the American Rubber Soul.
There you go.
I
There you
also
go.
like.
Huh? See, do I read or do I not read?
I'm a
Okay.
big defender of the Yesterday and Today album, which, people don't like these albums because they're not real. They're just albums that Capitol put together for the American market, right? That one. But I think that's a wonderful, wonderful collection.
I love the album. Actually, this the first album I got as a kid. I think I had the chicken pox or measles. I forget. I should know that, doctor, but I don't. My mother bought me Beatle again. Mother, father, forget it. But Beatles '65, which
Yeah.
I played that, and somewhere deep in the catacombs, I don't know where is the cover's long gone, but they're still with scratches and everything else. Beatles '65. And then I think this might have been the second one. And again, at the time, I didn't know, or did I care that, well, the British version has a different section of songs, and this one came out on 2 albums ago. I don't know. I could care
No,
less.
exactly. We didn't know. We didn't care. We did. After a while, people would have pen pals in England. So fans did start to realize that their albums in England were different, and that, for example, the Help soundtrack, I think, had only a handful of new songs on. So there was this sense as time went on that, like, maybe we were getting ripped off a little bit here and there, but nobody cared. This is like, we loved them so much, and there was this reservoir of goodwill that we had, that they had established, because they consistently brought happiness, joy, opportunities to connect with your friends, and they never disappointed us, ever.
There you go. Something that I wanted to bring to get your thoughts on, because again, being a year or two older, you might have had a better frame of reference on this. We had a singer-actress, Donna Lauren, on last year. And Donna, of course, was, amongst other shows, she was on The Monkees and Batman, and she was a regular on Shindig. And she talked about, because I always wondered, why did Shindig go off the air? Well, apparently Hullabaloo and Shindig, which both lasted about 2 years, great clips.
Yeah.
But again, there was that whole thing. The networks were like, this, and these are my words, too raucous, too this. And she pretty much came out and said was the whole, the whole black music thing. And they just started putting more pressure, and ultimately said, you know what, we're done.
Well, I'm confused. You're saying that they didn't want to have black artists on these shows?
Exactly. They thought it was my words, not hers, but too raucous. So
well, that's interesting because those shows, Hullabaloo and Shindig, were absolutely flat out attempts to sell baby boomer eyeballs to advertisers, and they knew that this huge demographic was so caught up in this pop music. They created these shows as showcases for these bands, and I'll tell you, look at these clips on YouTube. They're brilliant. They had the set designs were magnificent. They really are wonderful. But what's interesting, I talk about this in the book. I forget it was Hullabaloo or Shindig. One of them where they had Barry Maguire on singing "Eve of Destruction," and and you have the Byrds singing "Times They Are Changing." So what happened was that these networks presented young people with this music, and they didn't quite realize how subversive it actually was. Now, this thing about black artists, this is new to me. I hadn't heard that. It doesn't surprise me at all. They were concerned about that, but they didn't realize that they were really planting the seeds for all the protests.
Exactly.
And that happened in short order after those shows came on the air.
Exactly, and even though it was the whole civil rights movement, everything else, it was that she definitely conveyed that even Jack Good, who was the Ready, Steady, Go producer back in Britain, and then he said, oh, come on over and create a show here. Ultimately, he left before I want to say maybe midway through the second and final year, because the network started getting pressure, just like the Smothers Brothers got pressure from the Nixon administration, the Johnson administration before that, but just in general, it wasn't even from like the White House. It was just again, groups that were saying in the Deep South especially that, we got to tone this down. But as you said, the more that they stirred the pot and complained about it, then the more that you planted the seeds, and then of course the generation gap became even greater as we went on.
Yeah, I mean, what the creators of Hullabaloo and Shindig didn't realize at the time was that they were basically pushing the generation gap.
Exactly. Whereas shows, and again, I love them that I grew up with. I'm sure you remember American Bandstand, Lloyd Thaxton. There were several others. Clay Cole in New York on PIX. But again, that was a little more kind of toned down. But the other one, as you said, the production values, the people that were involved. I mean, you had people that became legendary musicians or stars in their own right, just as session people. Especially with Shindig. Hullabaloo was kind of more, I thought was kind of a ripoff of Shindig. But the clips you mentioned, the Barry Maguire, that was Hullabaloo, was very well done, and the Birds and stuff. But some of the stuff that they did later on would have never been allowed. I mean, again, if the Beatles weren't who they were, Sullivan, the Smothers Brothers, Hollywood Palace probably would have never put some of those things on the air because, again, too much pressure.
I think that they were so wowed by the fact that it was a slam dunk in terms of it would be successful because they knew how much young people loved the music, and I think that that's really all they cared about. That this was that advertisers were gonna love this. So it was all really about the money, and so it's kind of funny that they didn't realize that that they were. They didn't see these artists, they didn't hear these songs through the senses of young people, right? They didn't hear these songs the way we heard them. And so to us, many of these songs were, became important for how we saw the world. And it was very empowering. And it helped us define ourselves too as a generation. I mean, I think even to this day, this is why baby boomers have such a strong generational identity, because we were so reminded all the time of ourselves as this group because of the media obsession with the generation gap, but also this art, these artists, this music that was so much a part of our lives growing up. And no other generation had that experience quite like that, not to mention all the things that were going on in the world at the time.
You'd need an entire day, and even then, it's like that Billy Joel song where he covers like 5 decades in about 4 minutes. We didn't start the fire. Right. Candy Leonard joining us here on this hour. Our remaining moments here on Studio 411. The book Beatleness, now in paperback, how the Beatles and their fans remade the world. We're going to again, I have notes and notes and notes, so we're going to keep it short answer now, just to. But I do have one trivia question for you. Name 2 songs in the 60s where the Beatles are mentioned in the song.
Yes, that's Ball of Confusion.
Yes, very good. That was the tough one. And the other one I read in your book.
Oh, the other one is, of course, I Dig Rock and Roll Music.
Yes, which some people thought it was a knock against the Beatles. Noel Paul Stuckey says, no, it was not a knock against the Beatles. It was actually them saying, hey, we love the Beatles. But you see how things are perceived. What you see one way, me, I see another, whether it's because of cultural gaps, religious gaps, racial gaps, whatever. Everybody see, and of course that just stirs the controversy. Hopefully in a good way, but you never know. So very good. You get a point for that. So I didn't bring some of the 45s just to because we always have listeners that are like, what's a 45? But imagine like Hey Jude and Revolution on the backside. I mean, just, we're talking, that was worth your 99 cents back in the day, right? I don't know, what would that?
69 cents, maybe. Yeah, I mean, they were. Yeah, you'd go in, you would buy them. You'd go and you'd ask for them by name or by number, and you would get your little 45, and you'd go home and play it, and yeah. It's great.
Then by 1967, again, we're going to have Candy back on just to even talk about so much that's involved with this. The Summer of Love, the California sound, kind of catching up to the, the British invasion. Hippies, as you mentioned, Monterey Pop, which I didn't know Paul was kind of a consultant on that, which was one of the better rock kind of collection of acts, et cetera, et cetera. There was a comment in though that Monterey Pop, someone thought could have been even better. I mean, I thought the lineup for that concert was fabulous. I mean, it was, it was great,
It's very interesting to watch that now, and you see the seriousness of these, compared to oftentimes if you look at more recent performances of artists today, there's a rawness to it, and there's an authenticity to it that's really remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see now. My God, 68 generation gap is in full swing. I could just play Ball of Confusion and they tell it all in like 3 minutes. Unfortunately, I don't have the lyrics here. Otherwise, I would read it. Again, there's so much to cover in the book. Beatleness, how the
tax deduction.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, then you get to by '69, the Beatles are kind of started earlier than that. Again, where the music was progressing, but the band itself, amongst the four, was actually kind of starting to splinter and go their separate ways. Some might call it creative growing. Others call it maybe a little dissension. I don't know.
Well, they were outgrowing the whole box that they were in. I mean, they were growing as men, as young men. I mean, don't forget, they were in their early 20s when Sgt. Pepper came out, the mid-20s. So they'd been together a long time, and they were growing up. And, they had enormous power. They had more wealth than they'd ever need. And so why do anything you don't want to do, So they didn't enjoy touring anymore, so they got off the road. And, earlier, it's at the end of '66, but they did what they wanted to do, and so after Sgt. Pepper, they went to India. They kind of took a break. Of course, they took a break a little bit in '66 too, when John did the How I Won the War. But yeah, they were kind of getting tired of it. And of course, enter Yoko around this time. This is where people say, "Oh, Yoko broke up the Beatles." And if I talk about this in the book, where if you just look at what we knew as events evolved to us from what we could see, it's not unreasonable to think that she broke up the Beatles. Of course, we know better now, but they were tired of it, really, and of course we weren't.
More to learn from Beatleness, how the Beatles and their fans remade the world, now in paperback. So we're going to have you back on the show, and who knows, maybe we'll get a panel of all people like our demographic, and we'll just fill up another hour. Candy Leonard, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you back on. Stay with us here 1 minute. We thank you for joining us here, and I'm just holding these up real quick so you can see that I brought all this good stuff here, and we didn't get to all of it, but we will next time, along with Richard Nixon and God knows what else is going on. So Studio 411 is the name of the show. There are the Beatles as they go their separate ways. Larry Dasilva, I'm your host. Candy Leonard to my left. And we thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.